The Miraksaji Pagoda in Iksan was the largest Buddhist temple in the ancient kingdom of Baekje in the Korean peninsula. It's also one of the oldest Korean pagodas and the oldest known Buddhist pagoda. Originally built in 639 AD by Baekje craftsmen, it's had a major influence on the unified Shilla dynasty, Japan, and characteristics of a Korean house. According to legend in the Samguk Yusa, King Mu and his queen had a vision of Maitreya, a future Buddha of this world, on a pond in Yeonghwasan. They then had the pond removed in order to build the temple complex. In the 1980s, the site was excavated by archaeologists. It was completely dismantled and rebuilt starting in 1999, and it was eventually restored in June 2018. Miraksa now includes a museum and is listed as one of the national treasures of Hanguk.
These two structures, the double top pagoda and the single top pagoda, represent the cold energies and the hot energies in Buddhism, and they were placed in front of the Buddhist shrine.
The Joseon dynasty was the last Korean dynastic kingdom and lasted for approximately 500 years from 1392 to 1910. Also known as the Yi dynasty, it was founded by a general Yi Sung-gai. The craft that we made is called Gwanghwamun, which is the main gate on the south side of the Gyeongbokgung Palace, the main palace of the dynasty. The castle was first built in 1395 by King Taiho, but it was burned down in the Imjin War, only to be rebuilt in 1865 along with the gate by Gyeongsong Daewong. When looking at the build, one can see 3 doors accompanied above by a gatehouse and a shingled roof with each corner facing upwards. Unfortunately, during the Japanese colonial period, much of the gate and palace was destroyed, along with many other cultural assets which still may remain unreturned to this day. However, in 2010, the palace and the gate were both restored on their original sites once again.
So this is the Chikugi, and it was first used by King Sejong in 1441 during the Joseon dynasty. And the way that this device works is that when it rains, water is collected here, and then a measuring stick is used to measure the height of the water. And these were placed throughout many villages to keep data and make predictions for the weather. And it greatly helped farming, so this was used over the next years, and it was continuously improved upon.
This week, I constructed the Puruksa temple. This temple is a representative relic of the Buddhist culture from the Silla kingdom. The temple was built in 528 BC during the 15th year of King Bokhyung's reign, to wish for peace and prosperity for all. It was later rebuilt in 751 BC by Kim Taesong. Unfortunately, the temple caught fire during the Imjin War. After the war, the temple suffered serious damage and was often the target of theft. Starting in 1920, the temple has undergone continual restoration work. The temple now holds 7 national treasures, a number of additional important heritages, and is still standing today.
This week, I constructed a replica of the Seokguram, a grotto temple made of white granite located within the Puruksa temple complex. This structure was built by King Gyeongdeok of the unified Silla kingdom during the 10th year of his reign in year 751 AD. Kim Dae-sun, an architect from King Gyeongdeok's reign, began the construction of the Seokguram, originally called Seokbusa at the time, and the rest was finished during the 10th year of King Haegong's reign in 774 AD by the country. This construction was made due to the belief that one could attain Buddhahood through worshipping images of Buddha, signifying the strong Buddhist belief present at the time. There are 3 sections of the Seokguram: the main rotunda chamber called Chushil, which enshrined the statue of Buddha, a square-shaped antechamber called chunshil, where services were held, and the corridor. The structure references the Buddhist heaven to earth, where the main chamber portrays the heaven, the square antechamber portrays earth, and the corridor shows the gateway between them. The most interesting aspect of the Sakuram is the control of humidity. Because it is a grotto, there must be humidity, which would have caused there to be moss and the rocks to corrode. This issue was addressed by building a cool stream of water under the structure. Additionally, the ceiling was covered with pebbles, dirt, and roof tiles to control the air that flows in and out. Finally, Sakuram was able to not crumble because of a keystone located on the ceiling. Therefore, the scientific advancements that are found in the structure help explain how it was able to be preserved throughout the years.
It all began on August 29th of 1910 with Japan's occupation of Korea. They came in masses the nation had never seen before and would become the first major threat to the longevity of Korea. After 9 long and hard years under Japanese rule, the Korean people had enough. March 1st, 1919, the revolution would begin. Here you see the March 1st movement, which was a pan-national movement that pushed for Korean independence from the iron fist rule of Japan. On March 1st, thousands of Koreans all came together with only one thing in mind: to protect their beloved Korea. The March 1st movement was an act of resistance against Japan oppressing the Korean people. As part of Japan's colonization of Korea, the Japanese wanted to erase Korean culture. Manual labor and loyalty to the Emperor of Japan was emphasized in schools while forbidding the Korean language. They burned over 200,000 Korean historical documents, books, and their traditional clothing, a part of our history that would be forever lost. There was more that was plundered from the Japanese colonization era. They tore down our cultural buildings, including the Korean royal palace Gyeongbokgung, built in Seoul in 1395 by the Joseon dynasty. In an attempt to assimilate Koreans and unify the Korean and Japanese, rules and regulations were placed on language, religion, and education. We were forced to give up our religions to worship at Japanese Shinto shrines. This was an act of cultural genocide. We were forced to change our last name to Japanese last names and forced to be educated under the Japanese education system, which, as you can imagine, villainized the Korean people and taught our young that we were less than human. They would take our women hostage as conscript women. They would take our men and force them into labor camps. They tried to erase us from the face of the earth and stripped us of many basic human rights. Although Japan ruled over Korea for an entire generation, we did not succumb to the Japanese without a fight. Protest movements pushed for Korean independence. On March 1st, 1919, Korean independence was proclaimed and more than 1,500 demonstrations broke out. However, the Japanese suppressed these protests with violence, beating us with savage brutality by the thousands. But that didn't suppress our desire for independence. Protests still haven't ceased as many Koreans went out to form underground groups like the Party of 3000. While some others protested silently by refusing to speak Japanese or take on a Japanese last name. Our strong and burning patriotism, still alive, would pay off. Japan would eventually loosen up its tight control on Korea after they lost World War II. It would allow Koreans to publish literature and to assemble. It was until 1945 when the United States and the USSR captured Korea and ended Japan's rule, giving up all Korean land back to the Korean people. Ever since that day, Korea's resistance was never forgotten, and March 1st has been declared a national holiday. The Korean people would celebrate by shouting Mensa, which translates to "Long live our country." The origami piece you see in front of you is of Tupco Park. Starting from the left to the right presents a story from the past to the present. Near the left you see Japanese soldiers beating and stabbing Korean men and women, and as we move to the right it gets closer and closer to the present. This is represented by the crowd being predominantly Korean. This is further supported with the booth that is shown on the right side of the origami piece. Under Japanese rule, no such building would have been able to stand without the Japanese burning or tearing it down.
My origami set was of the Tokto Islands, and the history behind the Tokto Islands was that the two nations, Korea and Japan, disputed over these small islands over whose territories these islands belonged to, and it lasted for around 300 years. It was only after an altercation between Japanese and Korean fishermen that Tokto was recognized by Japan as Korean territory in 1696. So I'll be talking about what's on this origami set. So in between these two islands, there are these rock structures or formations, and most of these are named after what these rocks resemble. For example, the Puche Pawi, it's named the Puche Pawi because the rock resembles a puche, which is a hand fan. Similarly, the Chode Pawi is named because it resembles a candlestick, and the Tak Pawi because it looks like a chicken. And in the back here, we have the Samhyang Chegul Pawa. So on both of these islands, we have these piers, the Sodo Naruto and the Tongdo Naruto. On the side of this island, we have the Tokdo Yongto Pyosok, which is basically just a marker saying that these are in fact the Tokdo Islands. And over here we have the Tokdo Chonano Min Molyangbi, which is a memorial for all the fishermen who have died. And on the top here we have a lighthouse. On the back of the origami set, we can see the type of birds that inhabit the Tokdo Islands: the Pade Chebi, the Kwangin Karamegi, and the Simse.
An Jun-gun. An Jun-gun was born in 1879 and is one of Korea's most well-known national heroes. He was an independence activist, and his role in the fight for Korean independence from the Japanese was by assassinating the Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi. His patriotism further inspired Koreans, and about a year later, in 1910, Korea was annexed. To commemorate his death, there is a memorial museum in Seoul. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, March 26th, there's a memorial service held. You can also find numerous statues all around Korea in remembrance of him.